The morning Virginia Rhodes found the note tucked beneath the firewood stack. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it into the snow. It was not a love letter. It was not an explanation. It was a single line, written in a hand so careful it looked almost like a man had pressed his entire soul into the forming of each letter. They know you are here. Leave before Sunday. Sunday was 2 days away. Virginia stood in the doorway of her small homestead cabin on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, the January wind of 1882 cutting straight through her wool shawl like a blade made of pure spite. The firewood was stacked neat as always, split perfect and dry, enough to last 4 days. The man who had left it was already gone. She could see the bootprints in the thin crust of snow, large and evenly spaced, heading back north toward the ridge where the Watkins cattle spread rolled on for what felt like the entire world. She had never spoken to him. Not once. For 6 weeks, since she had moved into the old Hargrove cabin with nothing but a trunk of books, a cast iron skillet, and a secret so heavy it bent her spine, the firewood had appeared every single morning. Always before dawn, always stacked the same way. Never a knock, never a voice, never an explanation, and now this. Virginia pressed the note against her chest and looked out at the frozen Kansas plain, and for the first time since she had fled St. Louis under a false name with a dead woman's identification papers and the testimony of a murdered man folded inside her boot, she let herself feel the full, suffocating weight of her terror. Because if they knew she was here, that meant Harlan Voss knew. And Harlan Voss did not send warnings. He sent men. She had to go back to the beginning, to understand how she had arrived at this particular threshold of disaster. How a woman who had once worn silk to the opera could end up standing barefoot on a frost-covered porch in the middle of the Kansas frontier, holding a note from a man she had never exchanged a single word with, trying to decide whether to run or to fight. It had started in St. Louis, 8 weeks earlier, on a night when Virginia Rhodes had made the singular mistake of being precisely where she was not supposed to be. She had been a teacher. Not the fragile, decorative kind that parents hired to instruct their daughters in French and watercolor, but a real teacher at the Hartwell School for Girls, where she taught history and literature and quietly, carefully taught the older girls how to think critically about the world pressing in on them from all sides. She had been good at her work. She had been proud of it. She had believed, with the particular stubborn faith of a 28-year-old woman who had survived her father's bankruptcy and her mother's death and 2 years of genuine poverty, that honesty and diligence were sufficient shields against most of what the world could throw. She had been catastrophically wrong. The evening that unraveled everything had begun with an errand. One of her older students, Clara Denning, had left a leather satchel behind in the school office, and Virginia had agreed to return it to the Denning household on her walk home. The Denning house was a large one on Chestnut Street, the kind with a separate servant's entrance and a parlor that smelled of imported tobacco and ambition. Clara's father, Thomas Denning, was a prominent banker with political connections that reached all the way to Jefferson City. Harlan Voss was Thomas Denning's business partner, the kind of business partner whose name never appeared on any document but whose presence could be felt in every transaction. Virginia had arrived at the Denning house just as dusk was turning the sky the color of a bruise. The front parlor window was lit, and through the glass she could see 2 men in conversation. She had not intended to listen. But Clara's satchel contained what turned out to be not books but a sealed envelope, and when Virginia shifted it under her arm, the envelope slid free and she reached down to retrieve it. And in doing so, she spent perhaps 45 seconds crouched below that parlor window. 45 seconds was more than enough. Harlan Voss's voice was the kind of voice that had been trained to project authority in every syllable, and it projected clearly through the glass. He was talking about a riverboat captain named Sims. He was saying, with a calm that made Virginia's blood go cold even before she understood the full meaning of it, that Captain Sims had been handled, that the cargo that had been on Sims' boat would never reach its destination. That the men who had arranged for that cargo to travel were now in a position to be managed, meaning silenced, meaning disappeared, one by one if necessary. Virginia had understood enough about Harlan Voss's particular kind of business to know that cargo did not mean goods. It meant people. Specifically, it meant the people that certain very wealthy St. Louis men had been quietly financing the escape of. Men and women whose freedom was technically guaranteed by law but whose safety was perpetually in question, and who sometimes needed help moving northward in ways that required discretion and risk, and the willingness to ignore the anger of men like Harlan Voss. She had not known Thomas Denning was involved in that network. She had not known Voss knew about it. She had not known that Captain Sims was already dead when Voss used the word handled. She had stood up from her crouch, set Clara's satchel on the front step, and walked away at a pace that was carefully, deliberately not running. She had gone home, locked her door, and sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours trying to decide whether what she had heard was truly as terrible as it sounded or whether she had misunderstood some crucial piece of it. By midnight, she had accepted that she had understood everything correctly. By morning, when she arrived at school to find 2 men she did not recognize standing across the street from the Hartwell School, watching the entrance with the particular patient stillness of men who were paid to watch things, she understood that Harlan Voss had already identified her as a witness. She was in her classroom for 4 minutes, just long enough to take her most important documents from the desk drawer and the small amount of cash she kept in the spine of her annotated copy of Middlemark, which she had always thought a fitting hiding place. She left by the back entrance. She did not go home. She went to the train station and bought a ticket for the furthest destination the next departing train was headed toward, which happened to be Wichita, Kansas. On the train, sitting in the hard seat with her heart hammering against her ribs and her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, she had made a plan. The plan had not been a good plan exactly, but it had been the only plan available to a woman alone with limited resources and a very powerful enemy. She would go west. She would find somewhere small enough that strangers were common enough not to draw attention, large enough to have some basic commerce, and far enough from St. Louis that Voss's immediate reach would be limited. She would establish herself quietly, find work, and wait until she could figure out how to safely surface what she knew to someone with the authority and the interest to act on it. Caldwell, Kansas had seemed reasonable. It was a cattle town on the border with Indian Territory, busy enough with the cattle trade that new arrivals attracted little notice, small enough that she could afford the modest rent on the old Hargrove cabin, which sat at the edge of town and had been empty since the previous tenant had moved his family south. What Virginia had not anticipated was the Firewood. She had arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late November 1881, cold, exhausted, and operating on approximately 4 hours of sleep and the last of her money from Middlemark. She had negotiated her rent with the land agent, a preoccupied man named Clark who barely looked up from his ledger, and she had spent her first 2 days in Caldwell getting the cabin into a state where it was survivable rather than merely habitable. The fireplace worked. The roof was sound. The walls were solid. There was a wood pile at the back of the cabin, but it was nearly depleted, and Virginia had stood looking at it on her second evening with the pragmatic calculation of a woman who had survived genuine hardship and knew exactly how dangerous insufficient heat was in a Kansas winter. She had asked Clark about wood. He had pointed her toward a supply yard at the south end of town and named a price that was perfectly reasonable, but that represented nearly all of the cash she had left after rent. She had bought what she could afford, stacked it herself, and gone to bed that night calculating how long it would last against the temperature outside. She woke up the next morning to a stack of firewood at her front door that was 4 times the size of everything she had purchased the night before. Virginia had stood in her doorway staring at it with the pure, disoriented shock of someone confronting the genuinely unexpected. The wood was good quality, split clean and dry, the kind that caught fast and burned hot. There was no note, no indication of who had left it or why. She had looked up and down the lane, but the morning was early and gray and empty. She had told herself it was a mistake. Someone had delivered it to the wrong address. The next morning there was more, and the morning after that. After a week of this, Virginia had gone to see the land agent Clark and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether there was any kind of community arrangement in Caldwell for ensuring that new residents had sufficient firewood for winter, something she might have missed hearing about. Clark had looked at her with mild confusion and said that no, there was no such arrangement, and had suggested she try the supply yard at the south end of town. After 2 weeks, she had asked her nearest neighbor, a stout and forthright woman named Martha Ellison, who ran a small dry goods stall from her front porch, whether she knew who might have been leaving wood. Martha had given Virginia a look that contained several layers of meaning and said simply, "That would be John Watkins." Virginia had waited for more. Martha had offered none. "Who is John Watkins?" Virginia had asked. "Cattleman," Martha had said. "Has the spread north of town. Good man, quiet man, does not explain himself much." And that apparently was the complete available information. Virginia had thought about going to the Watkins spread and returning the favor, or paying for the wood, or simply thanking the man face to face. But something had stopped her. Something cautious and self-preserving that whispered that drawing attention to herself, even in the form of gratitude, was a risk she was not yet ready to take. She did not know this man. She did not know his connections. She did not know whether whatever charity he practiced could be trusted. So she had accepted the wood in silence, and told herself she would deal with it later, and spent the long cold evenings of December sitting by the fire reading by lamplight, and trying to figure out how to safely deliver the testimony she was carrying inside her boot to someone who could use it. She had written the testimony out herself, from memory, the night she arrived in Caldwell, writing it down in the careful, precise language of a woman who had spent a decade teaching young people the difference between evidence and assertion. She had written what she heard when she heard it, the exact words she could recall, and the context that made them intelligible. She had signed it with her real name. She had folded it in oilcloth, which she purchased at Martha's stall, and kept it in the shaft of her right boot next to her ankle. She had written 2 letters to federal authorities, one to a U.S. Marshal's office, and one to a member of the Missouri congressional delegation she had read about in a newspaper and believed might be interested in a credible account of corruption. She had not sent either letter yet because she was not yet sure whether the letters themselves would somehow lead back to her location, and she needed more time to think through the risks. But time, as she had now discovered, was no longer something she had in abundant supply. "They know you are here. Leave before Sunday." Virginia dressed quickly, pulling on 2 layers of wool stockings and her sturdiest boots, the ones with the testimony folded inside the right one. She built up the fire with the freshly delivered wood because, whatever she was about to do, she needed to think clearly, and cold made clear thinking genuinely difficult. She put water on for coffee, which was one of the few genuine comforts available to her in this cabin, and she sat at the small table and looked at the note again. The handwriting was careful. Not the handwriting of an uneducated man, but not the ornate cursive of someone who had spent years at a fancy desk either. It was the handwriting of a person who wrote deliberately, who meant every letter. The paper was ordinary, the kind available at any general store. The ink was standard black. She had to talk to him. Whatever she had been telling herself about caution and not drawing attention, she had to talk to John Watkins, because he had clearly already decided she was worth knowing about, and she needed to understand exactly what that meant. Virginia put on her coat, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the knife-cold morning. The bootprints in the snow led north, as they always did, toward the ridge. She followed them. The walk to the Watkins spread took 40 minutes, and Virginia spent every one of those minutes in the particular focused mental state that danger produced in her, a kind of heightened, brittle clarity where every detail seemed important, and the cold seemed less cold because her mind was working too hard to register physical discomfort properly. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she did not know. She thought about what John Watkins possibly could know, and how he could know it, and what his interest in her situation might be. The Watkins spread announced itself gradually, first a fence line, then a barn visible over the ridge, then the smell of cattle and hay and wood smoke, and then the house itself, which was not the grand ranch house Virginia had half imagined but a solid, honest structure, 2 stories of good timber with a wide porch and several outbuildings in good repair. Smoke was rising from 2 chimneys. A dog, large and brown and apparently gentle, came to meet her at the fence gate and walked beside her up the path without barking. She knocked on the front door. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that is not absence but presence considering its options, and then the door opened. John Watkins was, Virginia thought in the first stunned second, not what she had built in her imagination from Martha Ellison's 2 descriptors. He was perhaps 32 or 33, tall in the way of men who had grown up outdoors and used their bodies for genuine work, with dark hair and dark eyes, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was less handsome in the conventional sense and more truthful, which Virginia, who had spent years surrounded by people whose expressions were carefully managed, found unexpectedly striking. He wore a heavy wool shirt and suspenders, and his feet were still in thick socks, which meant she had arrived before he had finished preparing for the day's work. He held a coffee cup in one large hand. He looked at her without surprise. That was the thing that caught her attention most forcefully. He was not surprised to see her. He had been expecting this. "Mr. Watkins," Virginia said, "I am Virginia Rhodes. I live in the Hargrove cabin." "I know," he said. "You left wood at my door this morning." "I did, and a note." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "I would like to understand what you meant by it," she said, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her a little because her heart was hammering at a rate that was not, medically speaking, entirely comfortable. John Watkins stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. "It is cold." She hesitated for exactly 1 second, the instinctive hesitation of a woman alone going into a strange man's house in a place where she had no immediate recourse if things went wrong. But she looked at him and made the calculation she had always made about people, based on the 1,000 small signals of character that a decade of teaching and observation had calibrated in her, and she went inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon and something deeply, essentially domestic, and Virginia felt a small, unwanted ache of longing that she had not expected. She had been alone for 8 weeks. She had not realized quite how much the smell of an occupied kitchen could reach into the center of her chest and press on something tender there. John Watkins poured her a cup of coffee without asking whether she wanted one, and set it on the table in front of the chair that was clearly not his usual chair, which meant he had positioned the situation deliberately, and Virginia sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at him across the table. "Do you know someone is looking for me?" she asked, because that was the question, not who is looking, not why, but how he knew. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding what to tell her, which meant there was something he was deciding whether to withhold, which meant this conversation was going to be more complicated than a simple neighborly warning. "A man came to Caldwell 2 days ago," John said, "asking questions at the tavern and at the hotel about a woman matching your description. He was not from here. He was from the East, from the way he dressed and the questions he asked." Virginia kept her face very still. "What did he look like?" "Medium height, brown hair. Wore a good suit, had an accent that sounded like Missouri. Voss's men. They dressed well, she had been told. They did not look like hired violence. They looked like businessmen, which was, she supposed, accurate in its way." "Did he speak to you?" Virginia asked. "He tried." John's voice was perfectly level. "He came to the spread asking if I knew anything about the new woman in the old Hargrove cabin. I told him I did not know my neighbors personally and suggested he speak to the land agent." That was not precisely true, Virginia said. Something shifted in John's expression, the smallest possible movement at the corner of his mouth. That was not quite a smile but was the precursor to one. No, he said, it was not. Virginia looked at him. Why, she asked. Why the wood, why the warning, why lie to a stranger to protect someone you have never spoken to? John Watkins set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and the quality of his attention was the most unsettling thing she had encountered in 8 weeks of sustained unsettlement, because it was entirely without artifice. He did not perform consideration. He simply considered. I have been watching out for the Hargrove cabin since Margaret Hargrove died, he said. Her husband was a friend of mine. When I heard someone had taken the cabin, I went to have a look. I saw a woman arrive alone with one trunk in the cold with not enough firewood to last a week in Kansas in winter. I knew how to fix that part of it, so I did. That explains the wood, Virginia said, not the lying. No, he agreed. The lying was something else. He paused. You looked like someone running from something serious. A woman does not arrive alone with one trunk in November unless she has a reason to arrive that way. I did not know what your reason was. I did not think it was my business to know. But when a man from Missouri showed up asking carefully worded questions about you, it seemed reasonable to assume your reason and his questions were related, and that you were better served by him not finding what he was looking for. Virginia stared at him. She had been prepared for several possible versions of this conversation. She had not been prepared for simple decency delivered with this quality of directness. You do not know what I did, she said, or what I am running from. For all you know, I could be a criminal. You could be, John said, but you carry books in that trunk of yours. I can see the shape of it from the road when you carry it in from the wagon. And the lamp in your cabin stays lit until late, which means you are reading. Women who are serious criminals tend to be too busy for that much reading. His expression remained entirely sincere. Also, you paid your rent immediately and have not caused any trouble in 6 weeks, which puts you ahead of the man at the hotel who has lived here 3 years. Virginia almost laughed. The impulse surprised her so much she pressed her lips together to contain it. That is a very unscientific basis for trusting a stranger, she said. Most bases for trusting strangers are, John said. She looked at him for a long moment and made a decision, not the safe decision, not the cautious decision, but the honest one, which was the decision she had always made when the stakes were high enough. The man looking for me works for a man named Harlan Voss, she said. Voss is a businessman in St. Louis with significant criminal connections. I witnessed him discussing the murder of a riverboat captain and the planned suppression of a network that had been assisting people in danger. I have a written testimony. I have been trying to determine how to safely deliver it to someone with the authority to act on it without getting killed first. John Watkins absorbed this without visible alarm, which Virginia noted with the part of her mind that was always cataloging reactions. Most men would have shown alarm, or disbelief, or the particular kind of male discomfort that comes from being handed a problem that is bigger than expected. John simply said, "Federal marshals." I have been trying to determine whether a letter would lead back to my location, Virginia said. Not if it is mailed from Wichita rather than Caldwell, John said. I go to Wichita for cattle business twice a month. I can carry a letter. The simplicity of it hit Virginia somewhere unexpectedly. 8 weeks of solitary calculation, of sitting alone by her fire working through risk and consequence, and the solution was this simple. It required only a person she could trust, and she had somehow acquired without knowing it, without seeking it, exactly that. I do not know you, she said, not an objection, an acknowledgement. No, John said. But you know I have been leaving wood at your door every morning for 6 weeks without asking anything in return, which I think is a reasonable demonstration of intention. Virginia looked at the coffee cup in her hands. She thought about the weight of the folded oilcloth packet against her ankle. She thought about Sunday, which was 2 days away. She thought about the man in the good suit asking careful questions in the Caldwell tavern. All right, she said. It was the first of many things she said to John Watkins that she had not entirely planned in advance. She spent 3 hours at the kitchen table that morning. It began with the practical matter of the testimony and the letters she had already drafted, which John read carefully and quietly and said were well written and specific enough to be genuinely useful. He made one suggestion, which was that she address the letter to a specific marshal he had some knowledge of, a man named Holloway who had a history of pursuing exactly this kind of case, and Virginia accepted this suggestion because it was good advice, and because she was a woman who accepted good advice regardless of its source. Then, because they were both still sitting there and the coffee had been refilled, and because 8 weeks of near-total silence had created in Virginia a pressure of unexpressed thought that she had not previously acknowledged to herself, they talked about other things. She told him about the school in St. Louis. He asked what she had taught, and she said history and literature, and he asked which period of history, genuinely curious, and she said she was particularly interested in Reconstruction and the ongoing question of what the war had meant for the actual structure of American society, not just as an abstraction but in practical terms, what had changed and what had emphatically not changed. And John Watkins looked at her with an expression of focused attention and said that was exactly the right question, and that in his experience the answer was generally more complicated and less satisfying than most people were willing to admit. He told her he had been born in Ohio, the third of 4 children, and had come west at 22 after his father's death left the family farm in a state that required selling it to settle debts. He had worked cattle in Texas for 4 years and then moved north to Kansas when the cattle trails opened and the Caldwell market developed. He had bought the land north of town 11 years ago with money earned and saved over 5 years of working for other men, and had built it by degrees into what it was now, a working spread of 4,000 acres carrying approximately 800 head. He owned it outright. He said this last fact not with boasting, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built something from nothing and knew exactly what that had cost. Virginia thought about her own life, the careful accumulation of small securities, the teaching position and the modest apartment and the good coat she had left behind when she ran, and she felt a kinship with the nature of that kind of achievement, the kind that comes from sustained effort rather than inheritance. She should have left after the first hour. She knew that. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to finalize the plan about the letter and go home and begin thinking about whether she needed to actually move on before Sunday or whether the letter, once mailed, changed her calculation about risk. But she stayed, and the conversation kept finding new ground, and she thought at some point in the second hour that she could not remember the last time she had talked to someone like this, with the full use of her mind, without either simplifying or performing. When she finally stood to leave, John walked her to the door, and at the door she turned and found him closer than she had anticipated and said, somewhat formally, "Thank you, Mr. Watkins." "For all of it." "John," he said. She looked up at him. "Virginia," she said. He nodded, the smallest movement of acknowledgement, and she stepped out into the cold and walked home with the feeling that something had changed, though she could not yet have named precisely what. She spent the afternoon writing a clean copy of her testimony and drafting a final letter to Marshal Holloway, incorporating John's specific suggestion. She wrote carefully, the way she wrote everything, with attention to precision and the elimination of ambiguity. When she was done, she sealed both documents in an envelope, addressed it, and tucked it inside her copy of Middlemarch, which was the first time she had used that book for its secondary function since arriving in Caldwell. She slept badly that night, which was not unusual, but the dreams were different than they had been. Usually her dreams in Caldwell were about running, about men in good suits and the particular quality of being watched. That night she dreamed about the kitchen on the Watkins spread, and the smell of coffee, and a man with dark eyes who read her written testimony with the same focused attention he gave to everything, and said it was well written without making it sound like a surprise. She woke early and lay in the dark, and took stock of herself with the brisk honesty she applied to everything, and admitted that she was in some danger that had nothing to do with Harlan Voss. Saturday morning brought more firewood as always. She stood in the doorway watching the pre-dawn light turn the snow to pewter, and thought about the fact that this had been happening every day for 6 weeks before she had been willing to acknowledge that it meant anything beyond simple charity. She thought about what it meant about a person, to do a thing consistently and quietly, and without demand for acknowledgement. She thought about the difference between that and every other way she had seen people behave in her 28 years of life. She left the envelope on the table and went to see Martha Ellison. Martha was already on her porch, despite the cold, sorting through a fresh delivery of calico fabric with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who genuinely loved her work. She looked up when Virginia approached with the expression of someone who had been waiting for something. "You went to see Watkins," Martha said. Virginia considered denying it and decided that was not worth the effort. "Yes." "Good." Martha returned to the calico. "I have been waiting for one of you to do something about that situation for 6 weeks. Virginia sat on the edge of the porch railing, which was not comfortable but was functional. "What situation is that?" Martha gave her a look of profound patience. "Virginia, that man has been getting up before dawn every single morning in Kansas winter temperatures to bring wood to a woman he has never spoken to. That is not charity. That is a man who does not know what else to do with what he is feeling." She set down the calico. "And you are a woman who sits alone reading by lamplight every night rather than joining any of the social events in this town, which tells me something about your state of mind as well." Virginia opened her mouth and then closed it again. She had expected practical information from Martha, not this kind of clear-eyed assessment of her emotional situation. "I am in a complicated circumstance," Virginia said. "I have not been in a position to think about. People in complicated circumstances still have hearts," Martha said, not unkindly. "Usually more active ones than people whose lives are going smoothly." Virginia looked at the frozen lane. "I am going to be dealing with a serious problem in the next few days," she said. "After that, if things resolve favorably, I may be in a position to think more clearly." Martha picked up the calico again. "Then deal with your problem," she said. "But do not take too long after that. John Watkins is a good man. They are not as common as the word makes them sound." Virginia went home and wrote one more letter, this one to her old colleague at the Hartwell School, a woman named Agnes Pierce who had known her since her first year of teaching. She did not say where she was, but she said she was safe and that she hoped to be in a position to write more fully soon. She sealed it without a return address. Sunday came cold and gray, the sky the particular uniform white that meant snow was coming. Virginia was up before dawn, which meant she saw John when he came. She had not planned this precisely. She had simply not been sleeping, and the fire was already burning, and when she heard the soft, familiar crunch of boots in the snow outside, she opened the door before he could stack the wood and leave. John Watkins stood in her doorway with an armful of firewood and looked at her with an expression that was very carefully arranged into neutrality but did not quite achieve it. "You do not have to keep doing this," Virginia said. "I am going to find a way to pay you for the wood." "I do not want to be paid," John said. "Then I would like to at least say thank you in person each time," she said, "rather than receiving it without acknowledgement like a parcel left at an empty house." Something moved across John's face, swift and difficult to read. He set the firewood in the stack beside the door with the neat efficiency that characterized everything she had observed him do, and he straightened and looked at her, and the morning was very quiet around them, the snow about to fall, the town not yet awake. "There is a man watching the south end of town," he said. "Not the same one who was asking questions, a different one. He arrived yesterday evening." Virginia's stomach clenched. "They sent two." "It appears so." John's voice was steady. "I think you should not spend today alone." She looked at him for a moment, then stepped back from the door. He came inside. They did not speak immediately about the danger. They made coffee and the snow began to fall outside the window, softly at first and then with the serious commitment of a Kansas January storm. And Virginia found herself thinking that it was strange how a dangerous situation could also contain, in the middle of it, this quality of warmth and specificity. This particular man in her kitchen with his large hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and his eyes moving between the window and her face with a protectiveness so undemonstrative it took her breath slightly. "Tell me about why you chose Caldwell," John said. "When you left St. Louis," she told him. All of it this time, not the summary version she had given him before, but the full account, from the errand to the train to the 8 weeks of solitary calculation. He listened with the quality of attention she was coming to recognize as specifically his, complete and without interruption, the kind of listening that makes a speaker feel that every word is being genuinely received. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have been carrying this entirely alone." "I did not have another option," Virginia said. "You do now," John said. The simplicity of those 3 words pressed against something in Virginia's chest that she had been keeping very tightly sealed for 8 weeks, and she looked at the table and breathed carefully for a moment. "I need to go to Wichita," she said when she could trust her voice. "With the letter, I think it cannot wait." "The storm will ground travel today," John said. "Tomorrow, if it clears, I can take you. I have cattle business there anyway. It is not unusual for me to make the trip." "You are extraordinarily calm about all of this," Virginia said. John looked at her steadily. "Would panic be more useful?" "No," she admitted. "Then I will stay calm," he said. And there was something in how he said it, the small implicit promise in those 5 words, that lodged in Virginia's chest like a splinter made of warmth. The storm kept them inside for most of the day. John sent word to his ranch hand via a boy from the neighboring property, a practical arrangement that cost him a nickel and suggested a level of forward planning Virginia found impressive. They ate from what Virginia had in her kitchen, which was more than sufficient because she had been buying sensibly from Martha's stall all winter, and they talked through most of the afternoon with the easy thoroughness of people discovering that another person's mind is genuinely interesting territory. He told her about the Texas years, about what cattle work actually was in its daily reality, and she told him about her students, the ones who had surprised her and the ones she had worried about, and the one she still thought about sometimes. A girl named Frances who had come from a situation at home that Virginia had tried carefully and not entirely successfully to improve. He listened to the Frances story with great seriousness and said that not entirely successfully was still meaningfully different from not at all, which was the right thing to say, and also something she had needed to hear from outside her own head. Late in the afternoon, when the storm had peaked and was beginning to settle toward a more moderate snowfall, John said something that had clearly been waiting through several conversations to be said. "When this is resolved," he said, "when Holloway has your testimony and Voss is no longer a problem, what do you plan to do?" Virginia looked at the fire for a moment. "I am not sure. Go back to teaching, I hope. Find a position somewhere." "In Kansas?" John asked. The question was so carefully casual that it was the opposite of casual. Virginia looked at him. The firelight was doing interesting things to the planes of his face, and she was aware, with a clarity that felt like stepping from shadow into sunlight, that she was having a conversation with a man who had been leaving firewood at her door every morning for 6 weeks, and that she had been thinking about him more than she had admitted to herself, and that Martha Ellison had been correct about several things. "Perhaps in Kansas," she said. The silence between them after that had a texture it had not had before, a warmth that was not entirely from the fire, and John looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said nothing else about it, which was the right decision because neither of them was ready for the conversation that sentence pointed toward, but both of them knew it was now a conversation that existed, waiting to be had. The storm cleared overnight. Monday morning was brilliant, the sun on the new snow almost painfully bright, the sky the hard, clean blue of a Kansas winter at its most spectacular. Virginia packed the letter and testimony in her satchel and wrapped herself in every layer she owned. And John arrived at her door at 7 with a wagon and 2 heavy horses and his ranch hand. A young man named Ellis, who was about 20, and apparently understood without instruction that his job was to handle the horses and not ask questions. The drive to Wichita took most of the day. Virginia and John sat on the wagon bench with Ellis up front, and they talked intermittently and also sat in a comfortable silence for stretches, the kind of silence that is only possible between people who have passed through the stage of needing to fill it. The Kansas plains in winter were enormous and beautiful in a stripped-down, essential way that Virginia had come to appreciate over her weeks in Caldwell, the land reminding you constantly of its actual scale and your position within it, which was humbling in a way she found clarifying rather than diminishing. She mailed the letter at the Wichita post office with no return address, sending it to Marshall Holloway at his office in Kansas City as John had suggested. She mailed a copy of the testimony separately to the congressional representative in Missouri, which John had also suggested as a redundancy. She stood at the post office counter and watched both envelopes disappear into the mail system and felt a lifting sensation in her chest that she had not expected. Not relief exactly, because the danger was not over yet, but the specific lightening that comes from having finally done the thing you have been preparing to do. John completed his cattle business in Wichita in 2 hours, while Virginia waited at a respectable hotel dining room and drank the best coffee she had consumed since leaving St. Louis, and wrote in the small journal she had been keeping since arriving in Caldwell. She wrote about the drive, about the plains, about the way the light had looked in the late afternoon when they turned south toward home. She did not write John's name, because she was still being careful, but she wrote a description of the quality of his attention and the way certain silences with certain people were different from other silences. And then she closed the journal and put it away before she wrote anything she was not yet prepared to articulate in her own handwriting. They arrived back in Caldwell after dark, the horses tired and steady, Ellis dozing in his seat with the competence of someone who could sleep while managing horses without waking to any crisis smaller than an actual emergency. The town was lit and quiet, the snow blue-gray in the moonlight, and as they turned into the lane toward the Hargrove cabin, Virginia looked at the familiar shape of it against the sky and thought that she had come to feel in some complicated and qualified way that it was home. John stopped the wagon at her door and helped her down, and the contact of his hand on hers was brief and entirely ordinary, and she was aware of it in a way that was neither ordinary nor brief. She stood in the snow with her satchel and looked up at him, and the moonlight was very clear. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of it. I will check on the situation in town tomorrow morning," John said, "whether those men are still here." "I think they may be waiting for word from Voss," Virginia said. "The letter will take several days to reach Holloway. We may have a week or more before anything moves." "Then we will be prepared," John said. "You are not dealing with this alone anymore." She went inside and stood with her back against the closed door for a long moment in the dark, and then she built up the fire and made tea and sat by it until very late, thinking about all the ways that things could still go wrong and all the ways that, despite everything, she felt more solidly secure than she had in 2 months. Over the next week and a half, a pattern established itself that was not the old pattern and not yet anything else, but something in between, which Virginia found both unsettling and deeply pleasant. John continued to bring wood in the mornings, but now he knocked. Not loudly, and he did not always come in, but he knocked and said a few words and she answered. And sometimes he came in for coffee, and sometimes he had to get back to the spread, and the accumulation of these brief exchanges was building something she could not quite name but could feel as clearly as the warmth from the fire. 2 of Voss's men were still in Caldwell. John had identified them with the quiet certainty of a man who spent his life reading landscapes and creatures within them, and the knowledge that they were present was a constant low note of tension beneath the developing texture of Virginia's days. But they had not approached her. They were watching, which meant Voss was still gathering information rather than acting, which in turn meant the letter had not yet reached Holloway or, if it had, that the situation was still developing. She spent those days with more activity than she had allowed herself since arriving. She helped Martha Ellison on her porch stall on 2 afternoons and discovered that she genuinely enjoyed the commerce of it, the specific social texture of a small town's daily commerce. The way people's concerns and satisfactions were visible in what they bought and how they talked while buying it. She liked Martha, liked her directness and her wry observations about human nature, and the friendship that developed between them felt like something she had not known she was missing. On a Thursday evening, 10 days after the letter had been mailed, John came to her door at the normal time and said that both of Voss's men had left Caldwell on the morning stage, gone north, toward Kansas City. He had watched them board personally. Virginia stood in her doorway and processed this. That could mean several things, she said. It could mean Holloway received the letter and the situation has shifted enough that Voss has other concerns, John said. Or it could mean they have found out where I am by other means and no longer need to watch me here because they have another plan, Virginia said. Also possible, John said. He looked at her steadily. I would rather not have you alone in this cabin on those nights when I cannot check quickly. Virginia looked at him. The evening was cold but not bitterly so, and the sky was turning the colors of a Kansas sunset, the oranges and purples that came in winter evenings with a particular theatrical intensity, as if the sky were trying to compensate for the severity of the cold. Are you suggesting I stay at your spread? She asked, keeping her voice neutral. I am suggesting you consider it, John said. There is a spare room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Prentice, and her husband are in the eastward building, so it is entirely proper. I simply think you would be safer there until this resolves. Virginia thought about propriety, about what the town would say, about all the careful qualifications and considerations. Then she thought about what Martha had said. People in complicated circumstances still have hearts. I appreciate the offer, she said. Let me think about it tonight. She thought about it that night, and in the morning she packed a bag with her most essential things, her journal and her books and the good wool coat and the middle mark, and she went to the Watkins spread. Mrs. Prentice turned out to be a small, capable woman of about 50 with kind eyes and no apparent interest in making Virginia's presence a subject of either comment or gossip, which Virginia appreciated enormously. The spare room was clean and had a window that looked north over the snow-covered pasture, and Virginia stood at that window the first evening and watched the last light leave the sky with a feeling that was very close to peace, which was not a feeling she had expected. Living in proximity to John Watkins was both easier and harder than she had anticipated. Easier because he was exactly as he appeared, a man of consistent character whose moods were legible and whose habits were reliable, and in whose presence Virginia felt, with a consistency that was becoming impossible to pretend, was just gratitude, genuinely herself. Harder because being genuinely herself meant acknowledging things she had been managing from a safe distance. They sat by the fireplace in the evenings, when the work of the day was done, and they read sometimes and talked sometimes and sometimes did both simultaneously, one of them reading and then saying a passage aloud and the other responding, a kind of companionable intellectual exchange that Virginia had not experienced since her best teaching days and which felt, in the context of everything else she was feeling, almost unbearably good. On the 5th evening, John looked up from the account book he was working through, which was not a book for reading aloud but which he worked on in the evenings with the same focused diligence he brought to everything, and said without preamble, I would like to say something to you. Virginia set down her copy of Middlemark and looked at him. He put down the account book and turned to face her fully in his chair, which was a gesture that in John's economy of movement constituted a significant shift of register. "I know the timing is not simple," he said, "and I know you have been in a difficult situation that makes anything else feel secondary. But I think you should know that the reason I brought wood to your door every morning was not entirely altruistic." Virginia held very still. "I told you it was because I had been watching out for the Hargrove cabin since Margaret Hargrove died," he said. "That was true. And I told you that when I saw you had arrived alone in the winter, I knew how to fix the wood problem, so I fixed it. That was also true. But there is another part of it that I have not said, which is that the morning I walked to the edge of the lane and saw you carrying your trunk into that cabin alone, with a lamp in the window and the whole of January Kansas winter in front of you, I thought you were the most determined person I had ever seen. And I wanted to know you. And I could not think of another way to begin that did not feel presumptuous, so I did what I could do, which was make sure you were not cold." Virginia looked at him for a long time. The fire was burning warmly and the room was quiet, and outside the spread was dark and still under its covering of snow, and she thought about 6 weeks of mornings and bootprints in the snow and the careful handwriting of his warning note and the 3 words, "You are not alone anymore." "John," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "You do not have to respond to that right now," he said. "I said it because I thought you should know it, not because I require anything from it." "I know you do not require anything," Virginia said. "That is exactly the part of you I find most," she paused, choosing her word carefully, "significant." Looked at her with those dark eyes and waited. "I have been telling myself that this was not something I could afford to feel right now," she said. "That the situation was too complicated and I was too unsettled, and that the prudent thing was to manage it from a distance." She looked at her hands. "But I am not sure managing feelings from a distance is actually how feelings work in the end. I think they just wait." "They do," John said. "In my experience." She looked at him. "How long have you been waiting?" she asked. "Since the morning I walked down that lane and saw you," he said simply. Virginia Rhodes, who had survived her father's bankruptcy and her mother's death and genuine poverty, and the terror of the last 2 months and 8 weeks of solitary isolation in a Kansas winter, felt something inside her chest open like a door she had not known was closed. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his and looked at him at close range and said, "Then I think we have wasted enough time." John Watkins looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on a human face in a very long time, and he reached out and took her hand with the same care he brought to everything he did, the care of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding. They sat like that for a long time, not doing anything more than that, just the warmth of connected hands and the fire burning and the winter quiet outside, and Virginia thought that this was perhaps the most accurately romantic thing that had ever happened to her, not in spite of the simplicity of it, but because of it. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Kansas City. It was addressed to Virginia Rhodes at the Caldwell post office, forwarded by the postmaster, with the note that it had come from a federal authority. The letter was from Marshal William Holloway, and it was terse and official, and said exactly what she had needed it to say: that her testimony had been received and was sufficient to open a federal investigation into Harlan Voss and his associates, that her safety was being considered a priority, and that she would be contacted through secure channels for any further testimony required. Virginia read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table of the Watkins spread, and then looked up to find John watching her from across the room. "It is over," she said. The words felt strange. They felt like stepping out of a very dark room. John came to the table and read the letter himself carefully, and then set it down and looked at her with a steadiness that was also relief, the particular relief of someone who has been maintaining calm on behalf of another person and can now let some of it down. "Not entirely over," he said. "The investigation will take time and you may still be needed, but the immediate danger is resolved." "Yes," she said. And then the emotion she had been managing for months crested without warning, and she pressed her hand over her eyes and breathed carefully for a moment. And John put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned into him and let herself feel the full, enormous weight of everything she had been carrying, the fear and the solitude and the constant vigilance. And then the weight was gone. He held her for a long time, his arms around her in the practical and genuine way of a man who understood that comfort was not a lesser thing than action. And Virginia thought about 6 weeks of bootprints in the snow, of firewood stacked neat in the cold, of a man who had found the most unassuming possible way to say "I see you" and "I am here" without ever once pressing her to acknowledge it. And she thought there was no way to calculate what that had meant, what it had kept alive in her. Across all those cold, dark mornings when she had stood at her door and looked at the splitwood pile, and thought that the world was not entirely as hostile as it seemed. Virginia moved back into the Hargrove cabin in February, partly because the immediate threat was resolved and partly because she was aware that the town of Caldwell had been watching the situation with considerable interest, and she thought it was important to establish her independence standing clearly before anything else developed. She was a woman who had always held her own ground, and she was not going to stop now. But she had dinner at the Watkins spread on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. And John came to her door every Saturday morning, still with firewood, though by February the worst of the winter was breaking and the need was less pressing. He knocked every time. They talked for an hour every time. She found a teaching position in Caldwell in March, when the previous school teacher, a young man who had apparently found the work less interesting than he had hoped, departed for Denver. The town school board was chaired by a man named Peterson, who had initially looked at Virginia with the particular doubtful expression of a man who was not sure a woman was the right choice, but who had no other candidate, and who, after 15 minutes of conversation with Virginia in which she demonstrated her qualifications and her views on education with her customary precision, hired her on the spot and thanked her for being available. The school had 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, a range that required considerable pedagogical flexibility, which Virginia found invigorating rather than exhausting. She organized the older students to assist the younger ones in reading practice, which was both educationally sound and practically necessary given that she was a single teacher for the entire school. She ordered new books from a supplier in Kansas City, paying from the school budget and also contributing some of her own money, and the arrival of those books generated in her students a reaction she found deeply gratifying. She was happy. The specific, sustainable happiness of a person whose life has been rebuilt around things that are genuinely right for them, which she recognized as distinct from the precarious happiness of luck or circumstance. She had work she was good at and cared about. She had Martha's friendship and the particular social texture of a community she was becoming genuinely part of. She had, at the center of everything, a relationship with a man who showed her every day through his actions what his intentions were, who left firewood at her door even in March when winter was letting go, who read her recommendations from her students' essays with genuine attention, who drove her to Wichita when she needed to give her formal testimony to Marshall Holloway in April, and held her hand in the wagon on the way home after. When she was wrung out and quiet from the hours of official recounting, Holloway had told her in April that the investigation was proceeding and that Harlan Voss had been formally charged, that Thomas Denning had cooperated with investigators, that Captain Sims' death was part of a wider pattern that was being pursued with the full attention of the federal marshal's office. He had thanked her, with a directness that she had appreciated, for taking the risk of coming forward, and said that testimony like hers was rare and valuable, and had made things possible that would not otherwise have been possible. She had walked out of Holloway's Wichita office into the bright April sunshine, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about the 45 seconds crouched outside a St. Louis parlor window that had sent her entire life in this direction, and she thought that it was very strange how catastrophe and grace could arrive together in the same moment, indistinguishable from each other at the time. John had been waiting with the wagon. She had climbed up beside him and he had looked at her and said, "All right." And she had said, "All right." And they had driven home in the quiet that was their particular quiet, the kind that had always been enough between them. In May, the cottonwoods along the creek on the Watkins spread came into leaf, the new green almost painful in its brightness after so many months of brown and gray. And Virginia walked out to see them on a Sunday afternoon with John, and they stood at the edge of the creek bank and watched the water move below the new leaves. And John said, in his careful way, "I have something to ask you." Virginia looked at the water. Her heart was doing something that would not have been useful to describe clinically. "I know you value your independence," John said, "and I know that matters, and I would not want to change that. But I have been thinking about whether you might consider making this arrangement more formal, not to change anything about how you live your life or your work, but because I would like to know that you are here, permanently." Virginia turned to look at him. The sunlight was coming through the cottonwood leaves in small coins of light, and the creek was making its perpetual soft noise, and John Watkins was watching her with all of his characteristic direct attention, and something underneath it that was more vulnerable than she had ever seen in him. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said. She reached out and took his hand, which had calluses from honest work and was large and warm and familiar by now, and she looked at it for a moment. "Yes," she said. He smiled, a full smile, the kind that transformed his face from its habitual careful restraint into something fully alive. And she thought she had never seen anything she found more beautiful, and she stood on her toes and kissed him, which was the first time they had kissed, and the cottonwood leaves moved in the May wind above them and the creek ran below, and the world seemed to be in a state of exceptional rightness. They were married in June in the Caldwell church, a small ceremony that was nonetheless attended by what seemed like the entire town, because Caldwell was exactly the kind of place where a quiet cattleman and a new schoolteacher who had both arrived at their situations by difficult roads was exactly the kind of story people were rooting for. Martha Ellison sat in the front row and cried with the frank, unsentimental emotion of a woman who found that entirely appropriate. Ellis, John's ranch hand, wore his good shirt and looked proud for reasons Virginia found touching. The Prentice couple from the spread stood with the solemnity of people witnessing something they had been hoping for. Virginia wore a dress she had made from blue calico purchased at Martha's stall, not because she could not have found something grander, but because the blue calico was hers and Caldwell and exactly right, and her hair was up with the two good pins she had been carrying in her trunk since St. Louis like a held-over intention. John wore his good jacket and had cut his hair and was more nervous than she had ever seen him, which she found endearing beyond description. They said their vows in the clear, plain language of the time and place, and meant every word with the complete sincerity of people who have chosen each other not from necessity or convenience, but from genuine recognition of something irreplaceable in the other person. After the ceremony, Martha had organized a dinner at the town hall that went on until after dark, and Virginia danced for the first time in years and found that she had not forgotten how. And at one point late in the evening, she looked across the room at John talking to Peterson about the school budget, and thought that the happiness she was feeling was so complete and so specific that she wanted to press it into her memory like a flower into a book, to keep it exactly as it was in this moment forever. They rode home to the spread under a June sky so full of stars that Virginia, who had grown up in cities and was still not entirely used to what the sky was like without the interference of gas lamps, had to tip her head back and look at it for a full minute when they got out of the wagon. "This," she said, meaning the sky, meaning the spread, meaning everything. "Yes," John said. The summer moved forward with the pace of a life being properly lived, which is to say with work and warmth, and the particular satisfactions of a person whose days are organized around things that matter to them. Virginia taught through the summer as well, not full school sessions, but a supplementary program for the older students who were interested in additional instruction. And 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl named Louise, showed the kind of genuine intellectual hunger that made Virginia's work feel not like labor, but like privilege. She was planting a kitchen garden behind the house, which was something she had never done before and found unexpectedly absorbing, getting her hands into the Kansas soil and learning the specific local conditions through the particular school of direct experience. John helped her with this, not in the way of a man managing his wife's project, but in the way of a partner who had expertise she did not yet have and offered it without diminishment, which she found characteristic of him and continued to find meaningful. She wrote to Agnes Pierce in August, and this time included a return address, and told everything, the entire arc of it from the parlor window to the federal testimony to the blue calico and the June stars. Agnes wrote back a letter of 3 pages that contained a great deal of genuine joy, and also the news that the Hartwell School had quietly dismissed Clara Denning's father from its board of trustees, which Agnes characterized as a small but satisfying instance of justice. In September, Virginia began to understand that the kitchen garden was not the only thing growing. She told John on a Tuesday evening by the fireplace, simply and directly, which was the only way she knew how to say important things. She watched his face as he understood what she was telling him, and the expression that crossed it was so openly, undisguisedly joyful that she felt her own eyes fill with tears, which surprised her because she had thought she was past being surprised by her own emotional reactions. He held her face in his hands and looked at her and said, "Virginia," in a voice that was very quiet and contained more than she could have accurately transcribed. "We have approximately 7 months to prepare," she said, and her voice was entirely steady because she was a pragmatic woman, and then she laughed, which was the truest response available. The pregnancy progressed through the autumn and into winter with the solid, uncomplicated health of someone whose life had become stable enough to support it properly. Virginia continued teaching through November, because she saw no reason not to, and her students were largely matter-of-fact about the situation in the way that children who grow up close to agriculture tend to be matter-of-fact about most biological realities. The older ones were proud of knowing something adult and meaningful. Louise, her sharpest student, asked one afternoon whether Virginia planned to continue teaching after the baby arrived, with the specific focused concern of a 13-year-old girl for whom the answer mattered personally. Virginia had looked at her directly and said, "Yes, I plan to continue teaching for as long as I am capable of doing it well." Louise had nodded with the satisfaction of a girl who had been hoping to hear exactly that. John was attentive in precisely the way Virginia would have predicted, which was to say without hovering or unnecessary anxiety, but with a consistent practical care that manifested in things like ensuring the kitchen stove was always supplied without her having to ask, and that the path to the outhouse was always cleared of ice in the mornings, and that the chair at the head of the table, which had always been hers, now had a pillow on it, which she had not noticed for 3 days, and when she had noticed, it had pressed her lips together against the wave of feeling it produced. The winter was again cold and clear and full of stars. Virginia sat by the fire in the evenings reading and writing in her journal, the baby moving with the increasing frequency of an occupant who was finding its space insufficient. And John sat across from her with his account books and his occasional observations and their comfortable bilateral silence. And she thought about a cabin she had lived in alone through a long dark winter, and a stack of firewood appearing at the door before dawn every morning. And she thought that the whole shape of a life could turn on the kindness of someone who did not even knock. Their son was born on a February morning in 1883, in the room with the window that looked north over the spread, with the capable assistance of the town's doctor, a sensible woman named Dr. Catherine Hall, who had established herself in Caldwell the previous autumn. Virginia had known how it would be, intellectually, but the reality of it was larger than any preparation. The sheer physical intensity, and then the absolute completeness of the moment when the child was placed in her arms, and she looked at his face, red and outraged and perfect, and heard beside her John's voice saying something she would never be able to accurately report because of the quality of what was in it. They named him Samuel after John's father, Samuel Watkins, who from his first day on earth had his father's eyes and his mother's expression of concentrated observation, which both John and Virginia found deeply funny and deeply moving in equal measure. Martha came to see the baby on the third day and held him with the expertise of a woman who had raised her own children a generation back, and said he was the best baby she had seen in 10 years, which Virginia thought was probably not entirely accurate but accepted gratefully. Ellis came and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands looking at Samuel with a combination of awe and terror that Virginia found charming. Dr. Hall came back to check on the mother and baby and declared both excellent. Virginia lay in the room with the north window in the long light of a February afternoon with her son asleep on her chest, and heard John moving in the house below, the familiar pattern of his steps, and felt a quality of contentment so profound that it pressed against the edges of her chest. In the spring, when Samuel was 2 months old and Virginia was back in the schoolroom with him in a crib in the corner, which Peterson had initially raised an eyebrow at and then been persuaded to accept as a workable arrangement, a letter arrived from a Kansas City newspaper. A journalist there had been following the Voss investigation and had heard Virginia's name through channels he did not specify, and he was asking whether she would be willing to provide an account of her experience for an article about the federal case. Virginia thought about this for several days. She talked about it with John, who said the decision was entirely hers and that he would support whatever she chose. She thought about the network that Voss had targeted, about the people who had depended on it, and the captain who had been killed for running it, about what it might mean for a public account to exist that put the shape of the thing clearly on record. She wrote back to the journalist. She told him she would provide a written account, on the condition that she had final approval of how her testimony was represented, and that the account would be as specific and accurate as possible about what she had witnessed and what had happened as a result of her testimony. The article was published in June, and it was read widely enough to generate comment in papers as far east as Cincinnati and as far west as Denver. Virginia received a letter from a woman in Missouri. She did not know who said that the article had given her the clarity to report something she had been afraid to report, and that the situation she had reported was now being investigated. Virginia read that letter twice and then put it down and sat for a long time thinking about how consequences moved outward from a single point, like rings on water, further than you could see. The summer of 1883 was warm and good. Samuel was mobile by midsummer, crawling with the focused determination of a child who had decided that stationary existence was insufficient, and the spread became organized around the project of ensuring he did not crawl into the places that were inappropriately interesting for a person of his capabilities, which included the direction of the horses and the direction of the barn and any gap in the fence. He was fearless and curious and delightful, and the three of them together in the long summer evenings had a quality that Virginia did not try to describe in her journal, because she did not think language was adequate to it. John expanded the spread's operations that autumn, purchasing an additional section of land to the east and beginning the slow process of building it into productive pasture. He worked hard and thoughtfully, and Virginia watched him doing it with a kind of pride that was complicated and deep, not the performed pride of a woman who admires her husband's success, but the specific proud regard of a person who knows exactly what something has cost and finds the cost proportionate to the thing built. She had mailed her first letter to Agnes Pierce with no return address. She had arrived in Caldwell with one trunk and an oilcloth packet in her boot. She had spent 56 mornings accepting firewood she had never asked for from a man she had never met, whose kindness had been so undemonstrative that she had been able to almost pretend it did not mean anything until it meant everything. In the spring of 1884, Virginia discovered she was expecting again. She told John in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, while Samuel sat on the floor with a set of wooden blocks. He was systematically disassembling with the scientific focus of a researcher who has developed a specific hypothesis about load-bearing capacity. John had stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her, and then he crossed the room and held her, and she felt his hands on her back and his face against her hair, and heard him say her name again in that quiet voice that was different from every other voice. And she thought that whatever she had been running from, and whatever she had run toward, and however long the road between them had been, she was, precisely and completely, exactly where she was supposed to be. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara, arrived in November 1884, and where Samuel had come into the world with outrage and urgency, Clara arrived with a kind of serene assessment, looking around the room as if she was already cataloging what would need to be improved. Virginia and John both noted this characteristic immediately, and exchanged the particular look of two people sharing a private understanding that will be relevant for years to come. Samuel was 2.5 and took the arrival of his sister with equanimity after the first adjustment period, developing within weeks the proprietary pride of an older sibling, who has decided that a younger sibling is primarily a demonstration of his own specialness. Dr. Hall declared Clara perfect. Martha held her with the same expertise and made the same pronouncement about best baby in recent years, which Virginia now understood was simply Martha's way of expressing love. The years built on each other with the gradual, unglamorous, completely extraordinary quality of a life genuinely lived. Virginia taught school in Caldwell until there were enough students to warrant a second teacher, and she trained that second teacher herself, a young woman named Ruth who arrived from Missouri with better qualifications than Virginia had had when she started, and an even better instinct for what young people needed. And Virginia felt a satisfaction in that training that was as deep as any she had known. She continued to write. Her journal had become several journals, a record of a life in a specific time and place that she thought might someday be useful to someone who wanted to understand what it had actually been like. Not the mythology of it, not the dime novel version, but the real thing, which contained both more hardship and more beauty than the mythology suggested. John sold cattle and bought land and worked every day with the same consistent diligence he had always brought to everything, and the spread grew by degrees into something significant, not empire building but the steady construction of something durable. He was respected in Caldwell in the specific way of a man whose word was always reliable, and whose actions always preceded his words, which Virginia found was the truest kind of respect. Harlan Voss was convicted in the spring of 1884, a federal conviction on charges of conspiracy and obstruction. The conviction was reported in the Kansas papers with the matter-of-fact brevity of things that had been a long time coming and had finally arrived. Virginia read the notice in the paper over breakfast and set it down and went back to her coffee, and John looked across the table at her and she said, "Good," which was an entirely complete statement. In the evenings, when the children were sleeping and the house was quiet, Virginia and John sat by the fire with the same quality of presence they had always had together, which had become one of the central textures of her life. The firelight and the winter quiet and the sense of another person's complete attention available as a fact of the landscape, as reliable as the stars outside. She looked at him one evening in January 1885. 3 years and change from the morning, she had moved into the old Hargrove cabin with one trunk, and not enough firewood for a Kansas winter. And she thought about all the mornings she had opened her door to find the wood stacked neat and perfect, and the bootprints in the snow going back north, and the man who had never knocked and never explained because he had not yet known how to begin. And she thought that the truest things in life were often the things that arrived without announcement, in the before-dawn cold, the things that simply appeared and were what they were and asked for nothing. "You know," she said, "I have never properly thanked you for the firewood." John looked up from his book with the mild curiosity of a man who is used to Virginia's mental arrivals in places he cannot immediately track. "The firewood," he said. "All of it," she said. "All of those mornings. You kept me warm when I had nothing else." He held her gaze for a moment in the way he had always held it, with that complete and unhurried attention, and then he said, "You kept yourself warm. I just made sure the material was available." Virginia looked at him with a feeling in her chest so warm and complete that it was its own kind of answer to everything. And she crossed to his chair and sat beside him the way she had on that first evening 3 years ago, and took his hand, and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. Samuel would start at the school properly the following September, which Virginia was approaching with the specific professional discipline of a teacher who must absolutely not have favorites, and who was already certain this was going to be a pedagogical challenge of the highest order. Clara was developing language at a rate that suggested she had a great deal to say and intended to say all of it. Bread was healthy, the land was good, the stars at night were as enormous as they had always been. Outside, the Kansas winter was doing what it always did, pressing against the walls with its cold purpose. Inside, the fire was burning. The wood was dry and plentiful, split perfectly, enough to last for weeks. Virginia Rhodes Watkins, who had once stood in a doorway in the cold counting how many mornings it would last, sat by the fire with her husband's hand warm in hers and knew that she was covered. She had been covered, in all the ways that mattered, from the very first morning. And in the silence of that January evening, with the children sleeping above and the fire burning below, and the whole enormous Kansas night pressing in from outside, and holding the warm light of this house at its center, Virginia thought that the word home was one she had finally stopped reaching for and started simply living inside. The way you lived inside a thing that was so completely yours it no longer needed naming. John squeezed her hand without looking up from his book, and Virginia smiled and opened hers, and the fire burned on, and outside the winter turned slowly, inevitably, toward spring.